friends and family. I had about like 1,000 to 2,000 Facebook friends because in the Philippines, everyone uses Facebook. So I messaged them all one by one. Like I didn't use any automation tool. I spent days or like weeks doing this. I sent them the same copy pasted message and edited their names to invite them to subscribe to my newsletter. And I also put like a short description of what it does. A bunch of people thought I got hacked, but that was the way I got like 1,000 subscribers. So I mean, not bad, right?
Hey, Amanda. Welcome to an episode of Rising Giants with Max and Dom. Thanks for coming on the podcast today. To begin with, we'd like to just discuss the inspiration behind founding BackScoop in 2021. So if you could just give the audience a little bit of a backstory to what BackScoop is and how it got started.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me today. I've been looking forward to this one for the past few weeks, so thanks, Max and Dom. Well, for BackScoop, I'll give a quick introduction. So I started BackScoop in 2021, as you guys mentioned. It was mainly because I was working in the startup ecosystem for about 1 year at that point. So I started out as an intern in a startup in the Philippines that was working with startups across the globe, but mostly in Southeast Asia. So a lot of my time was spent really reading a lot of content about Southeast Asian startups. And one reason was because I was very new to the whole startup ecosystem. I started as an intern and then it was later my full time job. But another reason was because I also had to do sales for the company. We would be pitching these companies to hire our software engineers because we were a software engineering bootcamp. And I would email all these companies saying that, hey, I have all these engineers coming out every month. If you want to hire some of them, I can email you with a couple profiles every month. And that was the job I had. And I used the news to find the best leads because usually I would look at the ones that recently raised funding from certain markets, especially in um, like Jakarta and Singapore, or anything that was larger sized. So I'd usually reach out to those companies, but I was always looking at everything in Southeast Asia on a daily basis. But my struggle was that every single day I would read all of these publications, Tech in Asia, Deal Street Asia, TechCrunch, etc. I'd open the websites one by one every day, and then I would check what the news was. And I noticed that, I was checking multiple times a day, reading so many articles. And even if I took the time to read the articles, sometimes the information was incomplete, too long, or I just couldn't really understand what the company was doing. And I would just end up on this like little rabbit hole of reading that article, searching up another article, searching up another article, and then checking the company website to understand what the company is doing. And I had to do that for every single interesting company. And it was not very fun because it took so much time. And I felt like, if I was facing this problem because the news wasn't really delivering the information I needed in the right amount and it wasn't, understandable enough, then definitely other people are feeling the same thing. It was really important to me because if I wanted to talk to anyone about the startup, let's say if they were my client and I was talking to them, I definitely had to know their product, but also just to like be someone in the startup ecosystem and somebody starting out, like I really wanted to be able to talk about other companies with people and talk about the news with other people because otherwise, what else would I have to bond with them or to talk about them with? And so that's really the context that I had. And so I joined that company in 2020. In 2021, I quit because I had the idea for BackScoop because at some point I was like, Southeast Asia is growing at such a rapid pace because of COVID and digitalization. So the amount of startup news is just going to grow. And if I'm having this much of a hard time now, then definitely other people are going to feel this problem even more. I think I was a bit simple minded back then, but in my head, I was like, if I've learned anything from working at a startup for a year, it's that one. If you're going to build a startup, you need to solve a real problem. And I was like, okay, check. I have a real problem. Number two, it has to be a growing problem. And I was like, check again. And then the third was like, do I have the ability to try to solve the problem, at least for like the MVP? Like, could I build an MVP that would solve the problem? And I was like, I think I can. So check. And then the last, checkbox I had was, am I ready to quit my job and actually do this? And after a few days, I was like, yeah, I think I would regret it if I don't like take the plunge and do this, because all of these things are in check. Also, like it felt like the right timing. And it doesn't, to me at the time, I felt like I don't think all these kinds of stars align for every startup. Sometimes the market's too small or the timing is wrong. But for me, I feel like everything was right. And the only question mark was me. So I decided to just do it. And that's why after I quit my job, I spent 1 month building the website and the MVP, which was the initial newsletter. And then I launched it in August 2021. So that was the story. I was also a really avid newsletter reader as well at that point. So that's also the inspiration for the initial, yeah, for the initial MVP.
Okay, and yeah, what was it like those first few months, just kind of getting the initial traction and like validating that that there was demand for this product?
I was very like by the book and simple minded, as I told you earlier. So I was like, okay, if I'm gonna build a startup, what does like the internet and everything I read about startups tell me to do? Because as somebody who had no prior work experience before that job, and then like never had any other experience like working at a startup, I didn't know like what else a startup was like apart from the company I worked at and what I read about by like YC and other um, publications and guides, right? And when I read it online, it was when you have an early startup, you have to really grow the user base, and you have to have like the MVP. Then you have to validate that your MVP is correct. So it's like, okay, I have the MVP. I'll just keep publishing the newsletter. What I have to focus on now is getting users. So I spent a lot of the first few months really just finding more subscribers. So for the first few subscribers, those were my coworkers, friends, and family. I had about like 1,000 to 2,000 Facebook friends because in the Philippines, everyone uses Facebook. So I messaged them all one by one. Like I didn't use any automation tool. I spent days or like weeks doing this. I sent them the same copy pasted message and edited their names to invite them to subscribe to my newsletter. And I also put like a short description of what it does. A bunch of people thought I got hacked, but that was the way I got like 1,000 subscribers. So I mean, not bad, right? So I was pretty happy about that. Um, and then after I had my first 1,000 subscribers, it definitely wasn't enough, right? But the other thing I read online was that, okay, apart from growing your subscribers and building your MVP, the third thing you have to do is really listen to those users. So I also set up regular user calls every week with different subscribers who are willing to talk to me. So I sent like anyone who subscribed emails, like, if you really like this, you can set a time with me here and then we can talk about the newsletter. And then I was also running the superhuman product market fit survey there as well to figure out like what people liked and what people didn't like. And that was what I was doing in the first, I think, 1 to 2 months. And then apart from that, I also eventually ran out of Facebook friends. So I then messaged everybody I was connected to on LinkedIn one by one to invite them to subscribe to my newsletter. So that plus, continuing the subscriber calls, reading the feedback from the surveys, and then iterating the product based on the surveys. So I would add sections, remove sections, tweak a bit of the writing, etc. And that's what the first few months looked like. It was really tiring because I was the only one writing the newsletter at the time. Now we publish 4 times a week. I think at that time I published once to twice a week. And I was still writing everything back then and then doing everything else. So subscriber calls, writing, fixing all the tools. That was like my day to day.
That no, that's really great to hear about the subscriber calls. What were some of the maybe what were like some of the more like surprising bits of feedback, or things that you really took away that were useful, like, well, maybe just, yeah, maybe they were just surprising, I guess.
I remember one time, like, I don't know if this is in the first 2 months, but this is definitely in the first 6 months. I remember I wrote about a startup in the Philippines, or I guess you can call it, I guess I should rephrase it. I wrote about an e wallet in the Philippines. The backstory is that e wallet was founded by a telco. So that telco's e-wallet, I think they have their own like business entity. It's different from the name of the telco. And then they raised money and they had a valuation of $1 billion. When you look online, so I think like Bloomberg, all these big publications, even the local top newspapers, they all called it a unicorn, right? And even I knew at the time that people in tech, especially the Philippines, don't really view this as a unicorn because it was not built like as a real startup in the sense of like, it starts completely from scratch, minimal, like network to tap from. Meanwhile, this one was birthed out of the conglomerate, definitely tapped onto the users of the telco, etc., and had this like big network to tap into immediately. So I asked myself before sending out the newsletter, like, do I call it a unicorn or do I just call it like e-wallet gets $1 billion valuation? I was like, okay, since all the big publications are writing it this way, even if I think that it's not really a unicorn, I'm gonna write that it's a unicorn. And then I got this like one kind of upset, not angry, just upset email from a pretty influential person in the tech scene. And he was like, this is not a unicorn. Please don't write this. And I was like, okay, I should have listened to my gut. I think the lesson from that is like, even if like you're a new publication or like a new startup, what you would do best is like you're building for a smaller or more niche audience or smaller group of people or more focused group of people. You know what they want and you know what they think. I think I should have just listened to my gut because I knew that everyone would really not think it was a unicorn. Because I also asked a couple of people after and they're like, yeah, we don't really think it's a unicorn, but we'll accept it if the publications are talking about it that way.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And in the first year or so, what was the focus of the content? Was it mostly on the Philippines, or was it some other countries? And how has that shifted? I guess how which countries you're covering and um, some of the sectors that you're looking at.
So BackScoop was built to be the alternative to checking all of the tech news sites every single day or their social media pages. It's so that you don't feel like the FOMO throughout the day of like, oh gosh, have I checked like the website to check the news? Maybe something new is out. I should check it now on the website and read the article. And like the FOMO of like when you're scrolling on like Facebook or LinkedIn or any social platform, then you see this fundraise and you feel like you have to click it now or save it because you need to know about it. So instead of doing all that, we deliver all of the news in one place because we scour through all the platforms and have our own like sources. So basically, if you're not seeing it on BackScoop today, it's either not that relevant or not that big of like a piece of news, or it's going to be out in the edition tomorrow. So it's really the alternative way to consume tech news. So we never had like focus like countries. Like I wouldn't say like I focus on the Philippines or I focus on Indonesia specifically. We just cover the news and pick the most relevant pieces of information, biggest stories. But I would say that the kinds of stories we covered always differed every year. So when BackScoop first started, there were a lot of IPOs. That was the time of IPOs, like late 2021. I remember so many IPOs and SPACs. And then I think 2022, we had a lot of Philippine coverage. There were like Philippine startups left and right coming out. Definitely not every day, but it felt like we were covering a Philippine startup every week or every other week, when previously you would only see them a couple of times a month or every few months, right? So I think we've also seen like the different phases. So we had the IPO SPAC phase, we had the Philippines phase, and we also had that major crypto phase. So I tell you, I was writing those crypto articles myself. It was very, very hard, but I learned a lot in the process.
Yeah, it's no, it's crazy to think just like how much how much the whole space has evolved. Like as you were saying, SPACs, IPOs, crypto. Like in 2023, those three things weren't like that that prominent. So maybe what does the content look like today? In 2024, what kind of areas are you let's say most excited to cover and seeing the most activity?
Well, I can't say for just this year. But I think for the past few months, you've been seeing a lot more activity in other sectors like green, environment, sustainability as well. So those are popping up. More food tech has been popping up, I think, which has been interesting. Meanwhile, I think before you'd always see like the same kind of business or business model. So let's say in February 2022, you see like this, um, those early access wage startups, EWA platforms, early wage access platforms. I feel like I saw like five of them in 1 year, all in different companies and run by different people. Meanwhile, I think now you're seeing a bit more of a variance in the kinds of startups that are popping out, which is fun. Like there's some startups like I haven't never covered this kind of product before, or I've never seen this kind of product applied to this kind of sector before. So I think it's been a bit more exciting on that front because there's a bit more variance than before, and then more interest in sustainability environment. Because I think we're also stepping out of like I guess I would personally call it like foundational problems, like cards, e-wallets, mm, logistics startups that help you get a car or get a truck or get your stuff delivered. So I think it's nice that we're seeing things beyond that. So it's exciting for me. But I think personally, in terms of like trends that we're personally seeing, there were also times last year where I felt like, oh gosh, there's no company for us to write about today, and it was really a struggle for us to find news for that day. And I feel like this happened a couple of times in certain seasons. And it's like there was really a period of a few months where regularly we would be worried that there was no company to be featured. I think this is when people were not really announcing their fundraisers or doing just bridge rounds that they wouldn't announce anyway. Now I think we've been seeing more companies come out, but like I'm not saying this against any company, but I feel like mm, they sound a little less exciting than before. For example, the rounds are smaller, or when you read about it, sometimes it's like, okay, I'm not so sure about this product. So I think before there were lots of high caliber startups popping up. I think I'm seeing a few less high caliber startups pop up in the past few months,
Mm.
and like really cool
Yeah,
news stories. Mm-hmm.
yeah. I could see how, especially in terms of just funding slowdown over the past year, um, particularly in I guess more or less around the world, right? It's there's been that slowdown. So um, when one does come up, you can be a little bit more prescriptive about the details of that funding. So um, yeah, it's interesting to hear your take on that. Maybe if we're stepping outside of or stepping back from the the sectors and the content that you're covering and bringing it back over to the business that you built. And so in in your early days of starting the business, what was your vision at the time of creating it? Was it more that you were doing it because you wanted to, because you were interested in learning more about the startup space, or kind of what was that? What was the precipice for it all? And in part of that, what were some of the challenges and struggles that you had when first starting the business? Other than I think you mentioned before, was making sure that you can get out at least a few bits of content every week.
I think the vision sort of like changed, I guess. Well, I think I'll rephrase that. I think like from the beginning, the vision has always been the same in a sense, but what has changed is sort of the medium. I think before I thought like, okay, if I'm gonna start this startup, I am going to have to create this MVP first, which is the newsletter. But I was telling myself like, oh gosh, it can't be a newsletter forever. Um, Maybe this is just gonna be for the first few months or the first 1 to 2 years. I mean, now we're almost 3 years in, because my idea was that we start with the newsletter and then later on we have this AI powered platform where it has like better news curated or like news summaries and all this stuff. And I realized like, gosh, it didn't have to be that complicated. So I think in that sense, like what I learned in the past few years is that you don't really have to have such a complicated product. Sometimes like the simple MVP was actually enough and you just have to keep improving on it, because we've been seeing like a good reception for the newsletter. People really like the format. People are not necessarily really looking for like an AI powered platform that recommends all the right news to them. At the end of the day, I think what's always been the same was the vision to help people, one, just solve their problem, which was there was no easy way to stay updated with the Southeast Asian startup tech ecosystem. And people needed to do that because they want to stay connected with the ecosystem so that they can bring value to others or find new connections, find new jobs, get funding, expand, all these like personal and professional goals. So I think what's never changed is really that like we're here to really build for the people in the Southeast Asian side of ecosystem and build the right things for them um, as the ecosystem changes. I think for me, I always knew that solving the news problem was the first thing we had to do, but that's just the foundation of everything. Before you can do anything else to help people, I think you first have to solve like the gap in how people cannot access news conveniently and easily. And then from there, you can help them solve other problems like how do you get better deal flow, or how do you get connected to investors, or how do you get a new job, how do you hire the right people, how do you learn more about a certain market, and how do we get access to more in-depth content. But it's hard for people to do all those other things if they don't even have the news covered. I think staying informed is like the baseline.
Yeah, and in the as you were growing the brand and getting early traction and early to early traction in terms of as you were gaining more subscribers and getting more visibility amongst other media partners in the space, were you approached by any other outlets for partnerships or companies for partnerships? And how did you handle, how did you approach those conversations? Always curious because through the 3.5 years that we've been running Rising Giants, Max and I have had, we've remained independent, but have had certain conversations with potential partners over the course of the years that have come up, and it's always interesting to hear how another like grassroots media company approaches those kind of conversations, and
Do you
with what
mean
kind of
partners?
mindset.
Oh, do you mean partners like investors, or do you mean other media outlets?
Like other media outlets. So whether that's it could be other media outlets, it could be it could be other like telecom companies, larger corporates that have maybe wanted to partner, like that would want to partner with BackScoop in terms of um, where they see a strategic opportunity.
I think it always comes back to what kind of business you're running. Because I think for me, it was always very clear. Like, I just want to build a media brand that is relatable and really just, um, it just puts out exactly what people in tech want. It's not going to put
Mm.
out the things that make people scroll away or make people think, like, oh gosh, that's just sponsored. So I'm not going to like read that. Or, oh, this is just really boring, long thought leadership content that doesn't really tell me much. I really set out to do this to make sure everything is relatable, like funny or interesting or um, relevant. Make sure that it's something that people can be informed by, entertained by, or helps them solve a certain problem. So it has to have some kind of value that's created for that person and very, very tailored for people in tech. Like we don't write this for people who are just startup enthusiasts. Um, like no offense to them at all, but we are really trying to focus on building for people in Southeast Asian tech, working as a founder, a VC, an operator, or anywhere else in the ecosystem. So when we get feedback, when we write for people, that's always a mindset that we have in mind. Even if somebody who's really, really into startups but doesn't work in the ecosystem gives us feedback, at the end of the day, we go back to who is our audience and what will they want, and that's the same with working with a partner. As long as it doesn't jeopardize what we're doing, we're pretty open. And as long as it doesn't take away focus from what we are doing. Because at the end of the day, the work that we create for our main audience is the most important. So when we have like a partner like, example, Manila Bulletin is the oldest newspaper in the Philippines. And we work with them to create a regular column on their newspaper. It's published on print, it's published on digital. And I think in the Philippines, when I share that with people, they're like really impressed. Like, oh my God, you have a column at like 2021 with like the largest newspaper. But when I have bigger priorities at BackScoops, that also has to take a step back. And also when we write the kind of content there, we also have to think like, okay, we're writing for a different kind of audience here. But we also have to make sure that whatever we write is truthful to what people in the startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia would perceive it to be. Like, we're not going to write content that's untruthful or not really reflecting the ecosystem just because it will appeal to people from a different kind of audience. For example, I guess I have to be more specific. Like with the Manila Bulletin, it's for the general population in the Philippines, right? Not everyone there knows about tech. Not everyone there is even interested in tech. But when we write, we also have to make sure that when we talk about different startups in Southeast Asia or the Philippines, these are still startups that are interesting and high quality when perceived by people who are really in deep in like the startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. We're not just gonna feature random Philippine startups just because, right? So there
Yeah.
has to be some kind of harmony. Like, I understand that I might be working with a different company with a different audience, but there has to be harmony and a certain level of criterion standards across all the content.